Those who probably know who I am, Zev from Warrior at Law. Now, today having a very, very special guest on board who I've been wanting to have one of these chats with for quite some time. Some of you may be familiar with his name from some of the cases that we speak about regularly. I'm very, very happy, honoured to have you on board today, Shane, and thank you very much for taking the time to have a chat with us today. And we just want to run through a little bit about, if you want to give us a bit of background on your history and story, Shane, and some of your escapades, let's say, and your antics and actions over the years, some of which have not been done by anybody else in Australia.
Yes, in fact, yeah, it's very interesting. The Allodial Title legal precedent is probably the biggest one for me. But I'm a Ngambri Elder, so Canberra's named after my family. So I have 9 generations in a consecutive line of women that join my people to Canberra, and it's a very interesting and a very powerful place to come from because you can prove your birth mothers in times past, but you can't necessarily prove your fathers. The female gene, the mitochondria, is traceable. And as a result, it gives me the strength to stand up in all honesty in any forum and be proud of who my people are and where I come from. I'm a Ngambri Elder. It's Ngambri, if you like to put it in Anglo terms. And that's Canberra's original name. So when Canberra was first approached by people to settle here. One of the first people here was James Ainsley. And James Ainsley was an interesting person. He worked for the Campbell family, who were a big shipping company. You've probably seen Campbell's Wharves in Sydney, right at the Rocks. And that's the Campbell family. And in 1825, James Ainsley was tasked with picking up some sheep and driving them here for the Campbell family. But what happened? The Campbells, or Lachlan Macquarie, declared that the colony was out of food. There was no food. Can you believe it? No food. If they hadn't have killed all of the occupants of Sydney Cove, they would have had some people to ask, "Hey, what do you eat around here?
Yeah.
Can you teach us how to fish? Cats are being so stupid that they didn't know how to catch fish." I don't understand it. But anyway, the colony was out of food, so Macquarie seconded 3 ships from the Campbells and sent them off in search for food. And of course, the crew were rubbing their hands together with glee. Look what we've scored. We've scored 3 ships, and they never came back. And they went off on probably like pirates. And anyway, the Campbells were given reparations, 612 sheep to pick up from the government stores in Bathurst, and then go and claim land on the limestone plains down here in Ngambri country. And they arrived in Goulburn, and the Goulburn settlers said, "There's no land here to claim. It's all claimed. We squatters, we have the lot." Pointed him towards Yass. The Yass blacks didn't know what to do with him. When they saw him, they thought he was the spirit of a dead black fella because he was white. And he had all these funny, fluffy white things that they called mudder. In the Gundungurra language, mudder means cloud. So they thought they were clouds on legs, and he was a spirit. And so they sacrificed this woman to him. They'd stolen from the Ngambri people. There was a lot of women stealing that went on in those days between tribes. And they sacrificed her to him. Now, put yourself in her shoes. She's being sacrificed to a person that she thinks is a spirit. It must have been frightening, absolutely incredible. So she was told, "Take him back to your country." And of course she did. And one roll in the sack, she knew he was just another bloke, and she had a child to him a year later. And that was a woman named as Mingku. Mingku means born by the grass tree. And so she was the first Anglo Ngambri person born here in Canberra. And so that relationship goes back uh, all the way to 1826. And it's a very proud connection to have. But the important thing is in standing up in a court when I asserted a allodial title in the ACT Supreme Court, that I had the strength of those women, all of those women for all those years, And the judge who was the acting Chief Justice of the Australian Capital Territory at the time, a fellow named Shorgi, and Justice Shorgi said to me when I approached him, he said, "Are you aware of the enormity of the task you're taking on?" I said, "I have a fair idea, Your Honour." He said, "Right." He said, "Well, why are you in my court unrepresented?" And I said, "Because as an impecunious elder, I don't have the wherewithal to pay the extortionate fees of your legal services." He said, "Right." He said, "Let's get you some assistance." And so I'm going to take these headsets off. He said, "Right, you can still hear me."
Yeah, no, better with the headset on, Shane. Sorry.
I need I need the headsets on. So okay, yeah. So anyway, he awarded me the assistance and pro bono legal representation from the pro bono clearinghouse, and I had lawyers, I had barristers, and it was quite interesting because these barristers were rubbing their hands together with glee. They thought, "Gee whiz, this is a strong argument. We're going to get a lot of money out of this. This is going to get a massive compensation." It wasn't a compensation I was looking for. It wasn't
Even,
about money.
well, Shane, can I just
It
ask
was,
for the people watching who don't know what you actually achieved here, that as far as I know, you are the only guy in all of Australia who has actually had the court recognise your claim to an allodial title over your tribal ancestral lands. And you didn't do this, as you say, for compensation. It was done for recognition.
well, it wasn't even done for recognition, Zev. It was because there was a charity that went bankrupt. Oswald was a charity, and they had this lease on a land, which was a charitable lease that they didn't pay any money for. And when they went bankrupt, the liquidators, which was a company called Deloitte, they're a very large accounting firm worldwide, and they thought they could just sell up the property to pay the creditors. And I said, "No, I'm sorry, that was a charitable lease. You can't do that. And that property is to remain a property for people who need rehabilitation because of its arm's length to the community." So, people pushing drugs and alcohol can't do that to these people who are recovering. And they said, "Well, we're going to sell it anyway." I said, "Well, I'll see you in court."
Well, how can you sell
And they,
something that's not yours?
"Well, how can you sell something you haven't paid for?"
It's not yours. You don't get the right to sell it.
It's right. It's a lease, and it was a charitable lease that they hadn't paid any money for. And so, therefore, it's not for sale. And that was my argument in the court. Anyway, the long and the short of it is I was awarded an interlocutory injunction to stop the transfer of the land title in a block of what is essentially Torrens title land, as they call it. And that's another story. And that became an international legal precedent. This is the world's first precedent of allodial title that has happened anywhere and been published. So that's the big deal about it. The interesting thing about it is that during the end of the case, Justice Khashoggi said to me, "Look, Mr. Mortimer," he said, "this case is beyond my pay scale." Beyond my pay scale. That's what they were his words.
Yeah.
Here he was Chief Justice of the ACT Supreme Court, the National Capital Supreme Court. He couldn't rule over it. He said, "I could award the case to you, in which case I know that the Deloitte would appeal that." He said, "Equally, I could award the case to Deloitte." And he chuckled, he laughed. He said, "I know you'll appeal it." We had a good giggle. It was really interesting. But
Yeah.
then he said, "You have another option." He said, "You can withdraw the case and recommence in the original jurisdiction of the High Court." Now, I went back to my legal people. I had sacked my lawyers by this time because I wasn't there for money, and that was what they were all about, and I didn't want that. And so I had other legal people. I had professors of law advising me. One particular named Gary Lilienthal. And the recommendation there was just withdraw the case and sit on it. You've created an international legal precedent that nobody can take away from you.
Yeah. Now, I remember
And
when we first spoke, and this is going back to the beginning of COVID, when our lovely mutual friend Helen got us in touch with each other. Um, I remember spending many hours on the phone with you during this time as well, Shane, learning a lot about this because I didn't know anyone had achieved what you'd achieved until I spoke with you. I remember some of the points that you talked to me about with part of why you got that win in the Supreme Court was because the courts and the establishment in Australia determined that this matter can never be heard in the High Court because they're representative of the Crown and the Crown cannot challenge itself. So you kind of forced their hand to hand you that win in the court. And as you say, get a world first and certainly an Australian first for recognition of allodial title over ancestral lands.
well, subsequent to the case, there was a paper written by Gary Lilienthal and Nahaluddin Ahmed. Now, it's a lovely combination. We have a Jew and a Muslim writing the same paper. Nahaluddin Ahmed is the advisor to the Sultan of Brunei on international relations. Professor Gary Lilienthal, and both of them are professors. Professor Nahaluddin Ahmed is a professor of international relations for Royal Brunei University. And Professor Gary Lilienthal is a professor of international law. And so they wrote this paper called Colonial Land Title in Australia, a Metalegal Critical Inquiry. And lo and behold, it was published in a very, very, very respected law publication called the Commonwealth Law Bulletin that comes out of Buckingham Palace. It's the Crown's own instruction on new law that goes to the judiciary of 37 countries. And right there in the opening paragraph of the introduction, in the opening sentence of the introduction, it refers to me by name and case number. So that's irrefutable as to who created that precedent. And I'm very proud of it, and I stand by it because it proves many, many things. And one of the things it proves is that the Crown has no evidence of having acquired any land in this country. In fact, the Crown has no evidence of acquiring land in Britain, let alone any of the countries it's actually colonized. And Queen Elizabeth and I had that dialogue, which is very interesting. And when I asked Her Majesty, can you provide me with the evidence that your ancestors acquired the land from my ancestors to put your capital on and name it after my family? There was no evidence. And there is no evidence. And so the land remains. Now, since I've had a lot of public speaking, a lot of public engagements like this, and I had one where I was the keynote speaker for they call it the Council of Churches in Australia, where all of the archbishops and the bishops and the bhagwans and the who knows what, the heads of all of these faiths across Australia come together once a year. And this was the 10th annual gathering of this Council of Churches. So it was an important decade milestone for them. And there would have been hundreds of them. I couldn't tell you how many hundreds. But I said to them, it's very interesting, but the church is the largest property holder in Australia. And speaking of the church broadly, and they all sat back there with their arms crossed and feeling very smug and very happy. And they said, the only problem is that the land that the Crown has granted you has been knowingly granted to you with defective title. Yep. Well, right, wipe the fire, smiles right off their faces.
Jane, I often speak about this when I'm doing some talks and things as well, and describe it as idiots walking up beaches putting flags or rags on sticks is not a bill of sale or an exchange of title. There was no fair and equitable exchange. Now, something else I've learnt from my chats with you is that community essence agreement. That never occurred either.
Well, the interesting thing is that one thing that First People in this country have in common with everybody else We've all been lied to by the Crown. And the Crown, Australia, is a British Crown-owned construct. Crown-owned construct, the whole Australia construct. So the government, as we know, swears allegiance to the Crown by name of the monarch. Every politician, every public servant has to do that. So we have the public service, we have the government. The military swears allegiance to the Crown by name of the monarch, not to the people of Australia. The police swear allegiance to the monarch, not to the people of Australia. So this is one of the things. The judiciary swears allegiance to the Crown, not to the people of Australia. So it's not just we first people, it's the whole of Australia has no remedy in a court of law in this country because the court is owned by the Crown. And there is no law against genocide in this country because the Crown owns the courts.
Now, is this
And genocide, they can say, we don't like, for example, we don't like Lebanese people. We're declaring war, they might say, or they've often spoken disparagingly of the Iranian people and saying that they're going to declare war against Iran if it gets nuclear weapons or whatever, and so that they would then round up all of the Iranian people and put them into prisoner of war camps. They've done this before. They did it with the Japanese during World War II. The prisoner of war camps in this country were renowned. And I'm sure that there are other people in the country, not just the Japanese, but I would dare say German people of German descent were rounded up. And currently, Australia is spending billions of dollars on new concentration camps at Manus Island, at Christmas Island, and Nauru. Billions and billions and billions of your dollars on massive concentration camps. What are they getting ready for? You have to ask yourself.
Yeah, look, people like myself, Shane, have been warning people about this sort of thing for 25, 30 years that open your eyes, people. The writing's on the wall, follow the money, look at where they're spending all these dollars. Now, one of the biggies I wanted to ask you about too was that one about if you could explain a little bit for the other people listening here about a community assets agreement and why it is that your case was not allowed to go to the High Court.
I
Why?
withdrew, and I chose not to take it into the High Court because there is no remedy in the High Court for the case. So there's nothing. It's published. That's all I need. The fact that the Crown itself published the case is all the evidence I need. So nobody can take away the fact that allodial title exists in this land and it exists all over the world. Yeah, I advised, for example, Senator Jonathan Windyboy, who was the only Native American senator in the United States, and he was the advisor to President Biden on Native American issues. And they used that case to stop the pipelines going through Native American reservations. They rerouted the pipelines. And that was at millions and millions of dollars of cost to reroute them. And so it was a very interesting scenario. We had a case where there's a fellow who came to me up in Cairns, who is in and out of the jail up there. They're called Lotus Glen Detention Centre. His father's been in that detention centre for 25 years on spurious, nothing charges. And the Queensland government are terrible about the way they treat people. But Warren called me from jail. He would spend all of his spare few dollars on making phone calls to me, desperate to get out of the jail. And I said to him, go and appeal in the local court, the Cairns local court, and take a copy of the legal precedent with you and just ask the judge and tell the judge, because he's a Yidinji man, and Yidinji people own that land that Cairns is on and built on, and just explain to the judge that, look, you've looked everywhere, you can't find any evidence of the government or the crown acquiring your land to build cans on, and that they've built the court. The court is on your land. That your people are the allodial title holder of that area, and then hand up the paper to the judge because it's the Commonwealth Law Bulletin. The judge can't refuse the paper because it's coming directly from the Crown, and he's supposed to, or she, the judge is supposed to have actually read the paper anyway, because it's an instruction from the Crown to the judiciary. Anyway, he went in there and he said, "Look, this court is actually built on my land. He said, but I can't find the evidence. This is the paper on allodial title. Would you mind if I hand this up and if you could read the introduction?" And the judge took the paper and he looked at it and he saw it was very official, and he read the introduction and he looked up to him and he said, "Case dismissed, you're free to go." And he was out of jail. On his exit from the court, he was pummeled by a police officer who then charged him with abusing a police officer, which he didn't do. And then they took him straight back to jail. He's done this 3 times now.
Wow.
So, the fact is, the police are very heavy-handed in Queensland. And
Everywhere.
yeah, federal police here are very heavy-handed as well in Canberra. Yeah, and so the way they treated people who were protesting here, when there was the big lockdown on COVID. So many people came in. There were, I estimate, over 1 million people came to Canberra to protest, and there was enormous drone footage of the queue of people coming up Northbourne Avenue, blocking all the streets and so on. It was huge. And these are people whose families had broken down because of COVID. There were people who had lost their houses, lost their businesses, and things were pretty rough. And they came, a lot of single mothers. Their families had broken down, and they came in with their children, and the police treated them like they were just nothing. They blasted them with this. I don't know what you'd describe it. It was noise that burnt people. It really severely burned them.
AMFR weaponry, Shane, it's horrendous that our government would sanction the use of these energy weapons on its own people. That
They
our
not only sanctioned it, they instructed it be used.
Yeah. Now, look, one of the big questions I get asked from a lot of our members, Shane, is what exactly is an allodial title? If you could
Uh,
all
I
on
can I
what
can elaborate on that.
it is.
Long, long, long time ago, long before Latin was a language, long before Greek was a language, there was a German language, and a very ancient German language. And out of that language came a word, alud, A-L-U-D, which means no lord. Nobody to lord it over you and your entitlement to your land and to everything below the ground, to the core of the earth, and everything above the earth to the stars over your land. And that is your entitlement as the landholder. That is the entitlement of all people in the world, because we are all first people to somewhere, every last one of us. And so governments don't like that, and particularly colonizing governments. And when you hold that up to them, they get petrified. They really are frightened of it, simply because they don't have any ownership of the land. Every title that we have in this country, they say in the Australian Constitution, is derived from the Crown. But when the Crown has no title, how can it give any title? It doesn't have any title to give.
How can it give that
Now,
which it does not own?
That's exactly right. Now, the same thing occurred in the United States of America. So they have a sort of title, a sort of allodial title, but it's a fake version of allodial title, if you like. Um, when they had the War of Independence, there was a treaty after the War of Independence. And in that treaty, it had a cover page. The cover page had this very decorative thing that says a treaty of allodial title. But the Crown hadn't stopped to actually negotiate purchase or you know possession of title from any of the tribes across America. So it didn't have allodial title to treaty. So the treaty is in fact a false document. It's a lie, and this goes back quite a long time, as you can imagine. And to take you back on that journey, we have to go back to 1,000 years, back to the early 11th century, when there was a little boy born in Paris whose name was Guillaume. And Guillaume was the bastard son of the Duke of Normandy, the King of France. And Guillaume was the result of a fling that the king had with his tanner's daughter. His leather worker must have had a really, really good looking sort, and so the king had his way with her, and they had a child. And so Guillaume was born unentitled, no title at all, because he was illegitimate. And so he was of no consequence, and the king sent him off to the Vatican to be brought up. And he was brought up by Pope Alexander II. And he was mentored to go and fight a battle. Now, in fighting that battle, nobody expected him to win because, and it didn't matter if he didn't win because he was of no consequence being unentitled. But he actually shot an arrow through King Harold's eye at the Battle of Hastings and killed him. And on Christmas Day in 1066, Pope Alexander II proclaimed him to be King William the First of England, William the Conqueror. Now, the obvious question is, how can an Italian pope make a bastard son of a Duke of Normandy, illegitimate, unentitled, becomes the King of England? Yeah, it's like something out of a Monty Python comedy,
Yeah.
really, isn't it? Yeah, the life of Brian or something. Yeah,
Look,
and this is the life of Guillaume. So the long and the short of it is, Guillaume ran out of money. He didn't have enough money to pay his troops, and so he sent his troops out to do a reconnoitre of the villages and the boroughs of England and parts of Wales and bring back the information that they could collate and look at how much money they could drag out of those people in order to pay the troops. And it was in the interest of the troops, obviously, if they wanted to get paid, to provide that information. So they came back and they collated that and they compiled it, and it was published in 1085 as Domus Dei, which in Vatican Latin means God's house. Now, the English didn't like this very much, and they called it the Doomsday Book. And the time went on, and then about 10 years after the publication of the Doomsday Book, they were still there, and they were dragging money out of people. They bludgeoning the community into submission in order to collect the taxes. It was a case of pay up or you're dead, or pay up and you're dead, depending upon how much money you were worth. And that's how the British royal family started. And 44 generations later, we still have the same family. They didn't stop long enough to actually stop killing and start acquiring title to land. So the Crown actually has no evidence of acquiring title to land across Britain at all. Anyway, the long and the short of it is, in 1096, I think it was, a new pope came into the papacy, and that was Pope Urban II, and he issued the papal bull Terra Nullius, which was an instruction to the monarchs of Europe to go out and explore. And when you find land where the people are not Catholic, they're subhuman, and you take their land by force. So what they did is they took the example that they did in Britain and repeated the same thing. You go into a country, you set up a military encampment, and you bludgeon the people into submission, and you take their land. And that's the way the British have operated ever since. It's the way they operated here when they came here in 1788 after Cook's voyage. And that's another story, the Cook's voyage. It was a very interesting one. Um, but we still have the royal presence here, but I don't think that's going to last for long. And we'll talk about the way a republic in this country can look. But if you just go back a step to 1770 when Cook arrived, and I strongly recommend to you that you acquire this book. Yeah, I have it right here in front of me, ironically. It's called Lying for the Admiralty. Lying for the Admiralty by Professor Margaret Cameron Ash. Lying for the Admiralty, Professor Margaret Cameron Ash. Professor of Law at the University of New South Wales. And what happened is Margaret, when Cook set off on his last voyage, he gave all of his diaries and all of his logs to his wife as a parting gift, obviously expecting to come back. And he didn't come back. And when they found that he'd become soup in some island in the Pacific, the Admiralty was really troubled, and so they raided Mrs. Cook's home and they gathered up the original diaries. And so they subsequently wrote their own version of the diaries. Now, they embargoed Cook's original works for 200 years. And on the day they became available to the public, Margaret went to London and she took out the original diaries and the Admiralty's version of the diaries, and she compared them word for word, only to discover that the Admiralty's version of Cook's diaries was complete fabrication and lies. And that's why she had this thing, Lying for the Admiralty, this title. And Cook never ever raised a flag on this land. Proclamation Island, they never stepped foot on Proclamation Island. It was all lies. They made up this story about Tasmania being joined to the mainland, knowing full well that it wasn't, that it was an island, not part of the mainland. There's so many lies, lies and lies and lies and lies and lies, you know. But
Not,
to go back, Jess, you have a question?
yeah, not much has changed, has it, with the rewriting of history and changing of the facts? This has been going on worldwide for a very, very long time to suit the needs of a few at the detriment of the many.
Well, let's go back to the Catholic Church's instruction to the monarchs, calling anybody who's not Catholic a subhuman being or whatever. That's just crazy. But we've been lied to, and because of the origins of those lies in the Vatican, I describe it as a lasagna of lies. It's just layer upon layer upon layer upon layer upon layer, and the bigger it gets, the taller it gets, the more oily and greasy it gets. It's disgusting.
Yeah.
But but yeah, the fact is they didn't stop killing. This is the thing. They didn't stop killing for long enough to actually gather um, the, uh, the title to the land, to actually gather a track record of an evidence, if you like, of acquiring the title. So, and that's caused a lot of problems for them, and it's becoming an even bigger problem for them today. Now, in Australia, they did exactly the same thing as they've done everywhere else. It's exactly the same thing as they're doing in Palestine today. You look at what the story is. So there's this colonization became a very refined process.
And all built
The
on lies,
paper, sorry?
all built on lies and deceit, as you say, without any evidence of any exchange of title. Nothing's been done lawfully or fairly or justly, and this has been going on for many generations. And yeah, it's a horrible thing that the state of the world. The problem is now we've got things like the internet, which we didn't have back then, and we can look this up and actually research. But as you're saying, they changed the history. They
Oh,
remove
yes.
truth and rewrite it to suit their own needs, and it makes it very difficult to come up with actual factual information nowadays. And even looking up your case, Shane, sites that I could show people a couple of years ago no longer have that. Web page cannot be found. Error occurred. Uh, even looking and look for those watching, it's Mortimer versus Oswald Services 216 in the Supreme Court of Canberra. Yeah. Um, so hang on, I don't have to
Now,
move.
the paper, the sorry, the publication of the Commonwealth Law Bill in 2019, you should be able to find that.
Oh, there we
And
go. I've noticed a few websites I have shown people that in the past. It now says error page cannot be found. Some
wow,
sites that I look at to look up case law cannot be found. They are, as you say, attempting to remove the facts and history to suit their own needs. They do not want people knowing about things such as an allodial title, that you're the only guy I know of in many years of research that was actually able to achieve that.
yes, yeah, it's amazing, isn't it? Gosh, the interesting thing with that is that the papal bull terra nullius, people scream and yell terra nullius, and as you know, Justice Brennan handed down the Mabo decision, and he said, we've dispelled this terra nullius. We've overcome the notion of terra nullius, and it was interesting because I introduced Auntie Benita Mabo to Sir Gerard Brennan in his office in Castlereagh Street, Sydney, and it was quite an amazing thing. This would have been easily 10 years ago now, and he couldn't say much. He was very shy, and almost embarrassed, I think, because I'm guessing he knew as a good practicing Catholic that the notion of terra nullius was archived by the Catholic Church 500 years before the Mabo decision. So, and in 1553, a French Catholic named Etienne de la Boétie wrote a publication called The Politics of Obedience. And the politics of obedience is the blueprint for colonization.
Yep.
And it's very clear that the blueprint for colonization is you go in, establish a military encampment, and bludgeon the community into submission. But there's an interesting section in that book that I thought was worthy of mention, and that is he cites an ancient story of a man named Cyrus who captured the Lydians' king. Now, the Lydians were in Persia. So it's that cradle of civilization of the West Asian people that we're talking about. And he talks of this in an interesting way because you see, Cyrus had a problem. He didn't have enough troops to actually conquer the Lydians because the Lydians outnumbered him probably 10 to 1. And he had to work out and had to figure out how he could actually do this. He had their king. They were really upset because they loved their king and they wanted their king back. And so he had to think really outside the square. And he thought, I know what I'll do. I'll give them everything they want. I'll give them gambling. I'll give them prostitution. I'll give them games. I'll give them money. I'll give them everything they want. And then they'll love us and welcome us and we'll take their land. Now, what do we have today in this country? we have a situation where, you know, you have a telephone and you have a new version of a telephone, you have a computer, a new version of a computer, and you have a car and you want the next version of the car and you want the bigger house and the better furniture and you know, it's this constant thing of wanting more than you actually have all the time you're striving for the next thing. And what does that do? What that does is it keeps people in a job. That's why people have jobs. And the word job is an acronym. And the acronym is just over broke. And that's where they like to keep people just over broke so that they're so busy working and striving to get the things that they want and they don't have time to notice what the government is doing to them.
A bit like the old Roman times, isn't it, Shane? The old give them bread and circuses and they'll never revolt.
Yes.
Just
Yeah,
enough food to keep their bellies full, give them something to keep them entertained, and they won't ask.
right. I think Cyrus predates the Romans or just similar time.
Yeah.
But yeah, fascinating when you see that. But when you look at what they did here in this country, and just to bring it back to relevance, um, part of an element of colonization by Etienne de la Boetie is a process called decimation. And you can see this in the way things have gone in Palestine because it's all in our faces right now. But decimation is a calculated way of colonizing, and that is destroy 90% of everything that is native to a land, including the people, because you can then control the remaining 10%, hence the word desa, meaning 10.
Yep.
And that's part of the calculated process of colonization. And this is what they did in Australia, without a doubt. When you see, for example, in the annotated constitution of the Australian Commonwealth by Quick and Garran, published in 1901, they cite the 1780 as the 1888 census. 100 years after colonization began in 1788, they had the census. Now, Queen Victoria issued an edict that the native Aborigines are not to be counted in the census, but they did. They counted them anyway. And so if you go back to when Cook and Banks sailed up the East Coast and they estimated the population of what they saw of the East Coast, and bear in mind they couldn't see past the Great Eastern Range, but they estimated the population to be in excess of 1 million people. The truth be known, it was probably something more like 5 million people across the continent. By 1788, from 1788 to 1888, by the time 1888 census happened, the population was reduced across all states to 59,603 people.
Wow.
They did a number. It was poisoning. There were licenses issued to shoot Aborigines, and you had to bring back the ears to get your payment. Yeah, they were the sorts of nasties that went on. Lachlan Macquarie, way back in the early part, issued an order for any Aborigines who didn't comply with what they wanted. They were to be shot on sight and hung from the nearest tree as a warning to others to behave. And that's how they attempted to get First People here to be submissive. And it didn't work.
Right. So,
So,
and they're still trying now, and many of the tribes and people like yourself that I know still won't submit to the Crown rule because there is no legal claim over the land.
correct. And that's what my case proved is that the Crown has no beneficial title to the land. No allodium.
Yeah.
That's the legal term is allodium. And they make out like they have it, and they're so deluded. And the British Crown is deluded. And you don't have to see the way they behave. They're so insecure. incredibly insecure, and their aggression is born of insecurity. My 2 degrees are in applied psychology, counseling, and coaching. And so, I see them from that psychological lens. And I see people who are phenomenally aggressive, and what for? And why they don't have any actual right to be so aggressive. But they're aggressive because of their insecurity. It's why the American government is so aggressive. They say that America is the only country in the world to drop nuclear bombs on civilian population. But I have news for you. The British dropped nuclear weapons on civilian population right here in Australia at Maralinga in their atomic testing. I had a young woman come to visit me from the Canberra hospital where she had had both breasts removed because of cancer, who came from that very area where the bomb was dropped. And while she was sitting at my dining table having afternoon tea, with her carer who brought her up to me because she felt that there was counselling needed. And then she had a phone call right there or at the table, and the doctors from the hospital said, "It's too late. It's got into your bones now. You better go home and say goodbye to your family." And it was soul destroying. Yeah, and that's the result of the British atomic bomb testing at Maralinga. But
Again,
today, between Rockhampton and Bundaberg, at Shoalwater Bay, they have these playing war game things going on where the Americans are using depleted uranium weaponry. Now, that came out in a documentary called Blowing in the Wind, like the Peter Paul Mary song, Blowing in the Wind. And the answer, my friend, is blowing in the wind. And it sure is. It's a big answer. They're actually getting rid of depleted uranium on our shores
yeah.
and contaminating our people and our land, and it's wrong.
Yeah, without a legal claim to it. Shane, I'm going to have to wrap it up, mate, as I've got to run shortly for some other appointments. But I do want to say a massive thank you for taking the time to have a chat with us today. Hopefully, some of the guys watching this will be a little bit more enlightened as to some of the history of how things got to be as bad as they are in Australia, what an allodial title actually is. And if you're happy to, mate, happy to set another one of these chats further down the track and get some more information out because I'd love to pick that amazing mind of yours a little bit further and get some of the info trapped in there out to as many people as we can.
That'd be great, Zev. Out of adversity comes opportunities. So let's talk about the opportunities because
Well,
we in this country have enormous opportunity as a result of this adversity.
yeah. Well, look, let's do that, mate. I shall be in touch. And once again, a massive thank you for taking the time to have a chat with us today. And we'll set up another one of these sometime very soon.
It's a pleasure, Zev, anytime.
All right. Thank you very much, mate.
All the best. Keep up the